So the federal government is in another shutdown. Funding lapsed October 1st, 2025. We keep hearing this term, government shutdown. What does it really mean, though? Is it just a technical problem? Or is it, a political strategy? We've dug into the sources, lots of legislative history, some dense legal opinions, economic reports. Our goal here is to cut through all that confusion. We want to define what a shutdown legally is today, look at its history, which is actually more recent than you might think, and understand the real impact on, well, on you.
Yeah, and starting with definitions is absolutely key because honestly, the data itself can be confusing. Even the experts don't always agree on how many shutdowns there have actually been. If you look at every single time there's been a gap in funding since the modern budget system started back after 1976, you're talking about maybe 20 incidents.
20. Wow. That sounds like a lot of disruption.
It does, but, and this is really the critical thing, only about 10 of those were what we'd call major shutdowns, meaning they caused big operational problems, lots of federal workers getting furloughed. So there's a big difference between a quick funding lapse, maybe administrative, and a full-blown crisis situation. It's important to track that distinction.
Okay, let's unpack that then. So it's fundamentally a legal thing, not just, missing a deadline. Congress could always disagree on budgets, right? But why did these disagreements suddenly start causing these severe crises after 1980? You're saying it wasn't always like this?
That's exactly right. The legal trigger, the thing that actually causes a shutdown, is Congress failing to pass the regular annual funding bills. Appropriations, they're called. Or they need to pass a temporary fix, which is known as a continuing resolution, a CR, and they have to do that by October 1st, the start of the fiscal year. But, like you said, before the 1980s, things were different. Agencies often just kept going when funding lapsed. They sort of assumed the money would show up eventually.
Huh. So it felt more like a bookkeeping delay.
Pretty much. More like an accounting issue than a hard stop to operations.
Okay, so this wasn't just some slow bureaucratic shift. There was a specific moment, a legal turning point that really changed how Washington handles these budget deadlines.
Absolutely. The whole game changed. And it changed because of a very strict legal reading of an old law, the Anti-Deficiency Act. Now, this law goes way back, 1884 originally, though it's been updated. And it basically says government agencies can't spend money or even promise to spend money if Congress hasn't officially appropriated it.
Seems pretty fundamental, like basic budget control.
It is. But the crucial change came in 1980 and 1981. The Attorney General at the time, Benjamin Civiletti, issued these legal opinions, and he interpreted that Anti-Deficiency Act really, really strictly, like absolutely literally. His rulings basically made the act the legal mechanism for shutdowns. It meant agencies were now legally required to stop all non-essential work and send employees home, furlough them the minute the funding ran out. No more assuming the money's coming. The law itself now forces the shutdown.
Wow. Okay, that is the critical moment. It takes a political argument and turns it into this mandatory operational crisis. But as we see right now, some things do keep running. How is that decided? What's essential?
Right, so certain functions continue. Generally, it's things related to national security, public safety, basically anything considered necessary to protect life or property. Those are called accepted functions. Think air traffic controllers, border security, ongoing military operations, maybe some emergency health services. They stay on the job. But, and this is important, those accepted workers, the essential ones, often have to work without knowing when they'll get paid. It's the other areas, the ones funded by that annual discretionary spending, that just freeze.
Okay, that framework makes sense. But
Okay.
let's talk about the why, the political reasons. Looking at the drivers you mentioned, this current shutdown over healthcare subsidies, it feels like we've seen this movie before. Are policy fights now the main event, more than just arguing over how big the budget should be?
Oh, absolutely. That's definitely the trend. The root cause is almost always partisan fighting over policy. But the kind of policies become much more specific and high profile. We usually see maybe 4 main categories of causes. First, those big policy fights attached to funding bills, things like demanding money for a border wall or trying to gut the Affordable Care Act, the ACA. And this current 2025 shutdown, it fits right in. It's heavily focused on extending ACA subsidies and also demands for significant spending cuts. Second driver is just, raw partisan leverage, using the deadline as a weapon, brinkmanship. Third, sometimes it is about the overall size or makeup of spending cuts versus taxes. And fourth, occasionally you get debt limit fights tangled up with these funding battles, which just makes everything even more complicated and risky.
So who are the presidents dealing with this post-Civiletti? Can you walk us through the timeline of the really major shutdowns, the ones that caused significant furloughs?
Sure. So after Civiletti's opinions made shutdowns basically mandatory, The first really significant one under that new reality was under George H.W. Bush. That was in 1990. It was quite short, though, only about 3 days, and it was tied up in some really tough negotiations about reducing the deficit.
But the ones that really became huge political spectacles came later, didn't they?
Yes, absolutely. The real turning point, I think, in terms of political drama and sustained impact was under Bill Clinton. Mid-90s, he faced off against the new Republican majority in Congress led by Newt Gingrich. There were two shutdowns back-to-back. First a 5-day one, then a really disruptive 21-day shutdown. And those were explicitly about disagreements over budget cuts to big programs, Medicare, Medicaid, education, environmental protection. That really cemented the shutdown as a political tool.
And then, as you said, the policy fights got even more specific, especially around healthcare.
Exactly. Fast forward to Barack Obama. He dealt with a 16-day shutdown in 2013. And that was almost entirely because House Republicans were trying to defund or at least delay the Affordable Care Act. And then under Donald Trump, we saw the longest one yet, late 2018 into early 2019, a full 35 days. And that was very specifically about his demand for funding for the wall on the U.S.-Mexico border.
The way politicians talk about these shutdowns is something else. We found some quotes where presidents basically argued the exact opposite of what they did when they were the ones in charge.
Oh, the irony is definitely there. President Obama, during that 2013 shutdown, he blamed it squarely on a specific group. He said, one faction of one party in one house of Congress shut down major parts of the government, all because they didn't like one law. Very pointed framing. But yeah, the most maybe jarring example is Donald Trump. Back in 2013, when Obama was dealing with that shutdown, Trump was criticizing him. He said, and I'm quoting here, that a shutdown means the president is weak and it shows a lack of leadership. Of course, those exact words came back to bite him when he was presiding over that record 35-day shutdown later.
That quote really is stunning. Talk about political whiplash. It just hammers home that this isn't some technical glitch. It's all about political calculation and who takes the blame. It's a deliberate choice. Okay, so if politicians see this as a leverage play, what's the actual price paid by everyone else? Let's look at the real-world impacts on federal workers, on the services people rely on.
Well, the human cost for the federal workforce is immediate, and it's significant. During those big shutdowns in 2013 and 2018-19, we're talking about roughly 800,000 federal employees directly impacted at the peak. They were either furloughed, sent home without pay, or designated essential and forced to work without knowing when their next paycheck would arrive. Now, there was a law passed in 2019 that generally guarantees furloughed workers get back pay once the shutdown ends.
Right, so they eventually get paid.
They do, eventually. But think about the implication for you, the taxpayer. We end up paying people for weeks they didn't work. Just for the shutdown back in fiscal year 2014, the OMB calculated that retroactive pay cost about $2 billion. That's just gone.
Yeah.
A direct cost of the shutdown itself.
$2 billion. Wow, and that's money we don't get back. What about the services people actually use? It's not just federal paychecks being delayed, is it?
No, not at all. The ripple effects are pretty massive. You see things like national parks and Smithsonian museums closing immediately. That hits tourism hard, especially in communities near those sites. You get delays in processing passports and visas, which messes up travel plans and business. Then there are impacts on safety. For instance, routine food safety inspections by the FDA get scaled back, although they try to keep emergency functions going. But maybe one of the most systemically damaging things is the halt in releasing key economic data. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, part of the Department of Labor, they basically shut down data collection. I think the estimate was only one employee out of maybe 2,000 was working during one shutdown. So things like the jobs report, delayed. Inflation data, delayed.
Stopping the government's own economic reporting, that seems incredibly counterproductive, especially during a crisis. Does the wider economy feel that shutdown pain quickly?
It definitely does. Goldman Sachs, for example, estimated that for every week a shutdown lasts, it shaves about 0.2 percentage points off quarterly GDP growth. Now, usually growth bounces back in the next quarter once things reopen, but you still have that immediate hit. And that, combined with the lack of reliable government data, makes it really hard for businesses and even other parts of the government to make good decisions right when they need clarity the most.
Let's just clarify quickly who isn't feeling that paycheck pinch directly. Looking at the three branches of government, executive, judicial, legislative, who keeps getting paid during a shutdown.
Right, so the executive branch, that's all the agencies like HHS, EPA, COMBR, they're hit the hardest. We see their contingency plans, like HHS for FY 2025, planning to furlough maybe 45% of its 90,000 staff, huge numbers. The judicial branch, the courts, They're generally a bit more insulated. They can often keep running for a while, maybe up to 3 weeks or so in past shutdowns, using court fees and other funds that aren't part of the annual appropriations battle. And critically, the Constitution protects the salaries of Article 3 judges, federal judges appointed for life. Their pay can't be diminished, so they continue to get paid.
Okay, and Congress itself, the legislative branch, the ones who actually fail to pass the funding.
Well, members of Congress themselves, their pay is handled differently. It's considered permanently appropriated, so they're not subject to furlough and continue to receive their salaries. Congressional staff pay isn't guaranteed in the same way, though. Generally, only the staff needed to support core constitutional duties are kept on, and their payment can be delayed like other federal workers. So Congress is definitely better insulated than your average federal agency employee.
Given how disruptive these shutdowns are and how hard the deadlines are, Congress often seems to reach for this political band-aid, the continuing resolution, or CR. You mentioned these earlier. They temporarily fund the government, and the numbers are wild.
Yeah.
You said 47 CRs between fiscal years 2010 and 2022 alone. That sounds like just kicking the can down the road has become standard practice.
It really has become the default in many ways. It's the legislative path of least resistance sometimes. Just keep funding levels flat, avoid the hard decisions for a few weeks or months. But then you get this other, more targeted political maneuver,
Yeah.
the narrow CR. And that adds a whole different layer to the political game.
A narrow CR. Okay, that sounds like a way to selectively avoid pain. What exactly is it, and how does it change the shutdown dynamic?
So a narrow CR doesn't fund the whole government. It picks specific, usually popular or politically sensitive, activities and funds only those, while letting the shutdown continue for everything else. The classic example was during the 2013 shutdown. Congress passed something called the Pay Our Military Act, POMA.
POMA, right, Pay Our Military Act, so that kept military paychecks flowing.
Exactly. It ensured military personnel continued to get paid, along with certain civilian defense employees and contractors. Now, proponents argue this is responsible. They say, look, we need to mitigate the harm to absolutely vital functions like the military, protect national security, take care of our troops. You don't want to risk alienating those groups.
But doesn't that just reduce the urgency to solve the whole problem? If you shield the most visible or politically important parts, does it make it easier to let the rest of the government stay shut down?
That's precisely the argument from opponents. They say these narrow CRs are fundamentally unfair. They create winners and losers among government functions based on politics. And critically, yes, they argue it lowers the overall pressure on the negotiators. If the military is paid, if maybe veterans' benefits are protected, if air traffic control is running, then the political heat to cut a deal on the entire budget might actually decrease. It becomes a tactic, really. Soften the blow for key constituencies allows politicians to say, see, we're protecting X, while potentially hardening their position on the rest of the unresolved budget issues.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, if we boil it down, the big takeaway for you, the listener, is that these government shutdowns, they aren't some ancient feature of American politics. They're really a modern phenomenon, legally enabled by that strict interpretation of the Anti-Deficiency Act back in 1980 by Attorney General Civiletti.
Right. And we know now they're almost always driven by these intense policy fights.
Yeah.
The ACA, border security, now healthcare subsidies, and spending cuts. It's not just about numbers anymore. And how we even count them depends entirely on what you mean. Are you counting every little funding gap, or just the major ones that trigger mass furloughs and shut down significant operations? That definition matters.
And our deep dive really confirms this. Shutdowns are political choices. They are tools used for leverage. They aren't inevitable technical glitches. They can be avoided either with a temporary CR or through actual bipartisan compromise. But they keep happening because, at least for some, the perceived political advantage of the standoff outweighs the very real economic and operational costs.
Which leads us to maybe a final provocative thought for you to think of. We often say knowledge is power. Well, the government is arguably the biggest producer of public knowledge, especially economic data. When critical parts of that data machine, like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, just stop working during a shutdown, the government itself stops measuring its own condition.
So how does the economy really function? How can Congress or businesses or even you make informed decisions when the very entity causing the crisis also temporarily blinds us to its effects by shutting down the flow of reliable information? That engineered ignorance might be the most hidden, but perhaps the most profound cost of all.